So welcome everyone. Welcome to those of you who are watching on Zoom, where you've been for the last 3 years. But more importantly, welcome to all of you who are in this room, because you probably can't see this if you're watching on Zoom, but if you're in the room, take note. This is by far the most people who've been in this room since March 2020. And you can applaud. I think that's a good reason for applause. Yeah, there's some IPK old-timers here, and there's some IPK newcomers here. And the newcomers won't know this, but the old-timers will know that once upon a time, in the before times, what made the IPK such a special place is that groups like this got together face-to-face in person on a pretty regular basis. And we drank wine together, and we ate food together, and we listened to presentations, and we argued with each other. And we made up afterwards and advanced lots of debates and turned the university space here and the Institute for Public Knowledge into a really vibrant, dynamic, and exciting place. And seeing all of you here in the same room tonight gives me some hope that maybe this year will be a little better than the years past. I know now not to make too many predictions, because you never know what's going to be thrown at you, but it is really, really nice to see all of you here for our first event of the new academic year. It's also a really special occasion for us at the Institute for Public Knowledge, because tonight, come on in, it's okay. There's seats, just grab the seat. We're not just doing a conversation about an important topic. We're not just doing a conversation about an important book. We're doing a conversation about an important topic based on a book by a former IPK graduate student and fellow, Max Holleran, who did his PhD in the Department of Sociology here, spent many days writing in this office space, participated in many forums here, and is really kind of one of the IPK stalwarts. And it's just a thrill for me, I haven't even introduced myself, it's a thrill for me as the director of IPK, Eric Kleinenberg, for those of you who I haven't met, to welcome Max for this really significant event. He wrote a book called Yes to the City, Millennials and the Fight for Affordable Housing. It's just come out from Princeton University Press, generating a lot of debate in policy circles and in people who are concerned about the future of cities and development. It is a kind of undebatable fact that if we're going to figure out a way to live in a healthy way on this planet, keeping our ecosystems intact, we're going to have to live more densely. And that is going to mean developing all kinds of projects in areas where people have been hostile to having more people in a small amount of space. So we've spent years talking about the Not in My Backyard movement, where people who even express strong support for development projects or for forms of social service and care in the abstract don't want it to be where they live, because they'd rather not have that inconvenience. And that's the kind of issue that really hits home for people who work around universities and tend to spend time around people who consider themselves to be policy progressives, but who oftentimes act very differently when it's their own neighborhood, their own institution, their own family, their own life at stake. And Max is documenting the reaction to that movement, which is young people and others who are not so young starting to do something different and to say, yes, we actually need this development. Yes, we actually need to have more density. And I have to be part of this thing as well. It can't just be a gestural politics. It has to be a real one as well. So the format for tonight is that Max is going to talk about his book for about 20, 25 minutes. And then this is just like one of the great things about IPK and about being in New York City. You want to spark a good conversation. Can you find a good urbanist? You can find two of the great urbanists working right now a few blocks away. And so we're going to hear from Sharon Zukin, who's professor emerita at CUNY, really one of the legends in urban sociology, great scholar of cities and culture and political economy. And I'm excited to have Sharon back in this room. I understand it's Sharon's first time an in-person event since March 2020, so that's especially nice. And then We have NYU's own Ingrid Gould, who is professor in the policy school, Wagner School, and also the faculty director of the Furman Center, which is one of the great institutions doing research on housing in New York City. Ingrid is deeply involved in the real politics and real policy debates about how we do better in cities. And I'm really excited to hear your perspective as well. We'll have time to mix it up after then. The three of them can speak, and you will have time for questions. And without any further ado, please join me in kicking off this new year and welcoming Max Holleran back to IPK.
Sorry. I too have not been in a. There we go. Thank you so much. And I too have not been in a room with other people for a few years because I live in Australia, where we had a very severe lockdown, and I spent a lot of time with just me and a cat. However. It's really nice to be here, and it's also really nice to be in a room with so many people because I'm going to be talking about urban density. And I'm in the most densely populated room I have been in for 3 years. So I want to say that in many ways, urban density, how many houses you build on a single block, how tall you allow buildings to be, and how many people can healthfully and happily cohabit a neighborhood together has been a real primary issue in urban sociology since its founding well over 100 years ago. And when urban density was first considered, it was considered a major, major problem for social scientists. It had to do with issues like poverty, hygiene, social conflict between ethnic groups, and the degradation of the natural environment. So here you see the Lower East Side, a real sort of focal point for social sciences, and oftentimes a place that was maligned as dirty, dangerous, and unsavory. And in most American cities, we reached a sort of solution for urban density, and that was called suburbanization. And suburbs increased home ownership, focused on the nuclear family, and it focused on privatized rather than communal spaces. When we think about American urban form, we think about private property and we think about suburbanization. That in the rest of the world is what American urbanism is famous for, a kind of dispersed urbanism where people have their own front and backyards, and that is very important, you could say, both culturally and economically. And in this kind of 1950s, 1960s suburban dream, this led to very strict zoning laws and what we talk about today as only single-family homes were allowed. So neighborhoods that are zoned for one plot of land with a single-family detached house, kind of the American ideal of a suburban neighborhood. Oftentimes, these neighborhoods actually weren't so far into the suburbs, but were quite adjacent to the urban core. And of course, when we talk about this kind of early suburbanization, we think about things like redlining and restricted covenants that made them happen. And this brings up what Eric was very kind to introduce, which is the idea of not in my backyard, something that has been a real boogeyman in American urban studies for ages. And when we think about NIMBYism, we think about people protecting their major asset. Homes are people's major asset. They take mortgages on them to finance other things in their life, whether that be college or a medical emergency. And so in some ways, NIMBYism makes perfect sense. People want to protect the thing that is closest to them. They want to protect the place they live, and they want to kind of demarcate the zone that is their own. But that's also a tremendously problematic thing when we think about creating a sense of community. So what I've argued in the book, and what I think is really something that we see more and more, which is that NIMBYism becomes a catch-all basket that talks about far more than people who are concerned with their neighborhoods. So the original coining of NIMBYism was people who were opposed to Lulus. Lulus, for those of you who are not urban planners, it's not a brand of sweatpant. It's not a kind of lollipop, but it's locally unwanted land uses. So it's the person who doesn't want a crematorium, the person who doesn't want a trash compacting facility, but more problematically, it's also the person who doesn't want a methadone clinic, who doesn't want a hospital, or perhaps even an elementary school in their neighborhood. So, in terms of NIMBYism, we also think about people who are really able to live a middle-class lifestyle and who are cashing in on a lot of fairly regressive tax policies, whether that's the mortgage interest deduction tax or the federal loans after World War II that made it possible for a lot of people to buy large houses that have appreciated nicely in the suburbs. And I would argue that when we talk about NIMBYism in the US today, it's not really just a sense of self-interest or an ability to make sacrifices to a larger community, but we also have a lot more implied in that term. And I think a lot of times there's a racial connotation to NIMBYism that has to be looked at as well. But before I finish with NIMBYism and how this gave us the term YIMBYism, which is the subject of the book, I'll also say that there's something very natural about being a NIMBY. And one person's NIMBY who is fighting for their asset is another person's grassroots organizer, because it's people who are getting together at a grassroots level, at the neighborhood level, the kind of smallest democratic unit, and doing something to protect their shared interests at the neighborhood level. But as we all know, suburbanization has been widely criticized for its environmental effects, for the kind of social ennui that we see in so many different cultural products, the ticky-tacky little boxes, the Stepford wives. Every part of suburbanization now is under question for a kind of social and environmental disconnectedness. And this is where the subjects of my book step in. So 10 years ago, the YIMBY movement, which is Yes in My Backyard, was founded in San Francisco to argue on a single platform issue, which was more development, more of all kinds of development and building. So not just affordable housing, not just public housing, but across the board increasing the housing stock. And when they were found in the Bay Area, they started participating in zoning board meetings and community meetings and saying, and these meetings were predominantly just people who said no, who said we don't want this in our neighborhood, this building is too high, it's too big, it casts shadows. And they said, no, we want this building because any construction will lower the price of housing. And that's something that Professor Gould Ellen's going to hopefully talk about a little bit more, which is that that this actually gets into an argument which is really big in the YIMBY movement, which is the argument of filtering. So, which is the idea that housing built at any price point will eventually become affordable, and that so building housing, even if it's middle class or even if it's luxury, that helps take the stress off the entire housing market. So, in the meetings where people were showing up in the early YIMBY movement, it was oftentimes a very different kind of housing activist. It was someone who was well educated, who was often white, and who was under 40 years old. And they sought to kind of shout down the typical people who came to neighborhood meetings and say, no, we do want development, and it's not just for the developers, it's for renters as well. So here, this is from 2019, but this is just one of the things that is a kind of passionate YIMBY issue, which is the idea that to get more housing, we need both kind of ad hoc solutions where people go to meetings and say, no, we are in favor of housing, but also we need legal solutions. Oh, so this is coming up a little bit, it's a little hard to see here, sorry for that. But the pink is detached single family homes. that are exclusively zoned for that purpose. And then you can sort of see the city names, but you can see the percentage is the number of the percentage of that city that is just for detached single-family homes, and where you can't build a townhouse, you can't build a small apartment building, nothing except for the kind of common American ranch house. So the argument within the YIMBY movement was that if people can build in already wealthy neighborhoods, neighborhoods that have a lot of amenities, and neighborhoods that are close to transit, that even if they're building market rate housing, that housing can help solve the affordability crisis, because it takes the pressure off of gentrifying neighborhoods. And people who have some money and previously were going to gentrifying neighborhoods will no longer be forced to do that. So in this sense, they saw themselves as a kind of complementary movement to the more traditional housing justice movements that are involved in the struggle against gentrification that I think a lot of us are used to in the past 30 years. And so in this sense, it's very much defined as a kind of middle class housing movement rather than a working class housing movement. And that's a large shift in how we think about housing activism that I'll come back to at the end. And so just also to say one other thing, the YIMBYs are a kind of repackaging of a lot of ideas that are not new. So when we think about the kind of quintessential new urbanism of the 1980s that say we need denser neighborhoods, which gives us the environmental win of more walkability, or we need the economic boost of new development, which gives new businesses a chance in these neighborhoods and increases supply, or even the kind of more nebulous idea that this creates a new kind of sociality where people can be sharing public space together and be more sociable. Those are all ideas that were very much essential to the 1980s New Urbanism movement, but when they were presented by YIMBY activists, they were presented in the form of memes, in the form of Twitter rebukes to people, and on Facebook. Like, there's a very kind of online simplification of this that quickly attracted members. So while YIMBYism started in San Francisco just 10 years ago, there are branches in dozens of American cities, and there are also branches abroad. So when I did this book, I interviewed people from 6 American states, and I also interviewed people from Canada, from Sweden, from the United Kingdom, and from Australia. And one of the big questions for me was, what is it about this framing? Is it just the name YIMBY, or is it also something about how they channel urban planning information in a more kind of bite-sized way, in a way that's more visceral to people who are not in that urban planning profession. And so here, this is one of the logos of one of the early YIMBY groups in San Francisco, which started to shift just from going to zoning meetings to going into California politics. So in this sense, they were starting to be very visible in a lot of neighborhoods. They were aggressive online with attacking people who didn't want growth in their neighborhood. And I would say that their kind of media presence was funny on the verge of belligerent. And they promised that they would also basically just function in wealthy neighborhoods, that their job was to go into the downtown areas, the wealthy neighborhoods, and to propose growth there, and that they would not step on the toes of anti-gentrification groups. They would stay out of neighborhoods like the Castro, the Mission, Oakland. That very quickly was not the case, and they started advocating for growth in neighborhoods that have historically had conflict between newcomers and older residents or longtime residents, and also have had conflict between a majority of people of color living there and new white residents. So this quickly became a huge issue in San Francisco politics. And in some ways, what they tried to do is to kind of subvert the structures of community activism that had come before, things like zoning meetings, online groups like Patch, where people talk about issues, by saying, we're not part of the community already, because we have been priced out of this community, but we should be. And so the kind of authenticity that you're saying of, I've been here for 20 years and I'm a local, that is something that we don't have because we were never given the opportunity to live here. So one other thing they did in San Francisco was by expanding the scale of what it means to live in a neighborhood. And that brought it to the entire Bay Area region. So I'll also say that within this movement, it was a big, broad coalition, a coalition of people interested in housing, a coalition of technology entrepreneurs with millions of dollars giving them money, which is something I'm sure that we might talk about a little bit later, and also of real estate developers. And it was everything from people who were self-described YIMBY socialists who wanted to advocate for community land trusts, to people who were YIMBY libertarians. And they saw the abolition of single-family zoning in American neighborhoods as a first step in a kind of larger reform and liberalization of zoning laws altogether, to get places that look a lot more like Houston, Texas, where there's almost no zoning, which some of you from Texas might know and have experienced. So another thing that they were really adamant about is the idea that the ability to live in a big, successful city with high-paid jobs is a right of mobility that everyone should have. And so when they heard people coming to zoning meetings and saying, we're full, they found that to be something that denied a kind of economic and geographical mobility that was important, and particularly important to young people. So because most of the people in these groups are under 40 years old, they found that their idea of living in the city was an idea of personal advancement. And so here you have a Subaru from Colorado. It says, native, the kind of like sanctimonious, I'm from here, everyone else get out, and no vacancy. And oftentimes they problematically sort of equated this to international migration policy. And they said, how can you be a sanctuary city that lets people in from abroad, but you don't want to build new housing for people from the United States? Obviously, that comparison has some work to do in terms of the metaphor that it's going for, but I think it shows the kind of intensity that people felt like housing, the kind of lack of supply of housing was doing to their lives. And they quickly made many enemies in the anti-gentrification community, but also the kind of heritage community and historic preservation community, which accused them of destroying community character. So here's an Australian example. This guy's Tim Gurner. He's a youthful millionaire developer from the city of Melbourne, where I live. And he told Australian TV that it's not a supply problem for housing. It's not an economic problem of low wages. It's a consumption problem. And the millennials are buying too many coffees and too many fancy smashed avocado toasts. And so I think that this level of speaking out against people in a specific generation had a real galvanizing effect. It's not just Tim Gurner, but people all over the world who did this. And so now, if you look at YIMBY groups, which there are now like hundreds of, a lot of them have a little avocado next to their name. And that's not because they like vegetables, although I'm sure they do like vegetables, but it's because of this comment. And so there's a kind of memification in this movement, where things are taken to a new group of users, to people who use TikTok, to people who are on Twitter. But what's taken to them is urban planning dogma that's 30 or 40 years old. So I think there's a kind of interesting use of social media going on in these groups, which also can get very much out of control. At the same time, it's not a mass movement. It's not a kind of base building movement. It's not a door knocking movement. When we think of social movements that address housing, it's not those things. It's very much an elite movement that seeks to change public policy and also has a political wing. So they elected, for instance, Scott Wiener, state senator from California, almost entirely on this platform of building new housing. The mayor, London Breed of San Francisco, is also a YIMBY. And so they've been really successful in taking this single issue and making it stand as a major issue in California politics, but also places like Texas and Colorado. Hasn't been without controversy. Here you can see Scott Wiener, and it's the kind of idea that he is going to ruin San Francisco with high-rise development. The Hong Kongization of San Francisco is something you hear a lot in these circles, and I think there's definitely some unpacking of anti-Asian sentiment to be put into that. But the idea is, here's someone who his major issue is construction, and that construction is going to ruin our kind of quality of life, our way of life here. That said, just to briefly touch on the kind of housing morphology that the YIMBYs are proposing, they're really interested in this kind of middle part of the city. So while they talk about single-family zoning and the kind of outward suburbia, they really want to concentrate on this level of the kind of close inner suburbs that they call the missing middle. So this is the strip malls, the kind of the places where you see a couple apartment buildings or houses that could be duplexes. And they think that this provides a sort of natural densification that will let more people live in attractive neighborhoods, the kind of neighborhoods where you can have a parking space, but you can also take the bus, the kind of neighborhoods that you have alternative transport also available. And of course, this is also a kind of advertisement for their own demographic of people they're hoping to help. So the missing middle is also the missing middle class, and they are very much middle class activists. So this is kind of a larger sense of the movement being something that is not coalition of working class people, people in public housing, not super wealthy people trying to protect their mansion, but people who are trying to get a sort of regular middle class life in an expensive city like Austin, Texas, like Washington, D.C., like New York. And so, one thing that I think is really important in this struggle is that they have taken essentially class categories about who can afford housing and who can't, and they've replaced them with generational categories. They've said it's not about people who don't have the money to buy a house or to rent an apartment. It's about the people, it's about millennials versus baby boomers. And so, I think a lot about the British sociologist Imogen Tyler, who talks about how social movements are often middle-classed to make them more palatable to a wider audience. And I think this is absolutely a case of that. It's people who are trying to take the class elements out of housing, because we find class very difficult to talk about in this country and in many others, and to make it an issue of generation. And I think that there's a lot to discuss about, and this is the crux of the book, which is how does that change to generation, get a wider audience, get a broader coalition, but what's missing there as well? When you have that happening, what do you lose when you talk about generation rather than class? I'll just say, I think I've talked quite a bit, so I'll just go, and I just have a couple. This is an ADU, accessory dwelling unit, which is a big part of YIMBY culture. This is public housing in Singapore, and I'll say really quickly that a couple provocations about the YIMBY movement and about what it means for how we talk about housing. The first is that it kind of leaves public housing off the table. So this is a luxury public housing estate in Singapore called the Pinnacle at Duxton. It's 3 structures that are 50 stories tall. And the YIMBY movement says, look, we're happy to have public housing, but that's not happening in the United States at this moment. And we can argue for it, we can fight for it, but it's just not attainable at the federal or state or local level. And so we need to think about other ways to increase the housing supply. And so I think that there's some questions about what happens when public housing is off the table, and is there a possibility that this kind of movement that advocates market rate housing could cooperate in the future with public housing, or with more traditional anti-gentrification movement people. So the idea of this kind of larger ecosystem of housing movements where they can all work together, and that's something proposed by the YIMBYs, is that really going to happen? And what tensions will emerge if that does start to happen? Another issue is the, I like this Raymond Carver story, which is what we talk about when we talk about love. And I feel like there's a lot in the YIMBY movement, which is what we talk about when we talk about housing. It's not just housing. It's about the 2008 economic crisis and young people's lack of savings. It's about their lack of economic opportunities. It's about young and old political dynamics, the kind of the acrimony between people in their 70s in DC and people who are younger in American cities. And so I think there's a lot of kind of energy that goes into this movement, which is very much focusing on housing, but using housing as a tool to discuss all kinds of other political issues. And if you just go to the NumTot meme website, which is New Urbanist Memes for Transit-Oriented Teens, you will find so many things that are about transportation housing, but are really about generational divides in the United States today. And then last, I'll say, density was a hard sell before 2020, March of 2020. Americans like their backyards, they like driving, and the idea that we can all live closer together and build more housing and cooperate in tighter, smaller neighborhoods, that was difficult then, and it's much harder now that we have epidemiological fears to reckon with. So what will this look like past the pandemic, I think is a good question, and hopefully one we can discuss more. So thank you so much.
No, that's okay. No, I'll try this one. I felt so good when I came into this building, not only because I hadn't been here in 3 years, but also because almost everybody was wearing a mask, so I didn't feel marginalized. So thanks, everybody who's wearing a mask. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Better now? Okay. Okay, there we go. All right, so I do feel good that most of you or all of you are wearing masks, and I don't feel marginalized. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks, Max. I'm really glad to meet Max too, because I have a blurb on the back cover of the book. I think it's a really good book. But I only met Max a few weeks ago on a podcast. We shared a podcast, so I'm really delighted to follow his very strong presentation to speak about his very strong and timely book. I want to emphasize at first not the housing issues, of which we're all painfully aware, but the great strength of Max's work in looking at YIMBY as a social movement. And particularly, it's a generational movement, as he just closed with this point. It reminds me of my youth in the 1960s when I was a student, and the enormous clash of values and strategies between the old left and the new left. And for those who don't know, the old left was the left of labor unions and former Communist Party stalwarts in the U.S. who put every struggle in terms of class and who emphasized the proletariat's interest in social improvement, social revolution. The new left, that's my generation, the new left came up with cultural struggles, came up with battles against alienation, eventually struggles against patriarchy, came very closely related to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, but more about the culture of a new generation. So I can understand the YIMBY movement very emotionally in terms of a generational struggle. What's a little more difficult is to realize that it's my generation that is being struggled against, okay? And some of the achievements of, well, a slightly older generation, the Jane Jacobs generation. Now, Jane Jacobs, her name has practically become a meme in recent years. Oh, Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses. Oh, she was representing the good. Robert Moses was representing the evil. But in this context of YIMBYism and NIMBYism, the values of Jane Jacobs are actually the bad values. They're the values that are being struggled against. And this is very interesting. In my own work, I am not a great advocate of Jane Jacobsism, but I can identify with the struggles and the achievements of the 1970s, particularly in cities like New York, that are identified with the Jane Jacobs generation. For example, Jane Jacobs championed historic preservation in terms of a mix of old buildings and new buildings. When you consider the current and recently passed struggle over rezoning Soho and NoHo, that is this area, and the area just to the south of this neighborhood. And you think about Jane Jacobs advocating old buildings as well as new buildings. You think about how rezoning this area to build new, taller buildings, you're not talking about increasing density. You are talking about destroying the fabric of a part of the city that is the embodiment of some of those generational values. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. Usually people who talk about defending neighborhood character now are characterized and caricatured as rich elitists. So it's not such a good thing to talk about character. But I am bringing up that the urban fabric connected with Jane Jacobs type values is at risk and has to be handled very carefully in increasing density of population, increasing density of buildings, making taller buildings. That's not always a question of protecting property values. It could be a question of losing a memory, a tangible evidence of the memory of the city that has to be handled very carefully. Another Jane Jacobs type value is unslumming, allowing a neighborhood and encouraging a neighborhood and supporting a neighborhood to improve itself, to improve the physical quality of buildings through all kinds of social capital and a little bit of financial capital. So what happens with unslumming, as we see in some areas of the city, is gentrification. The homeowners in low-income and middle-income areas of the city that have been able to hold on to their brownstone houses through thick and thin, through crime waves and disease waves and all kinds of crises. Those people who have put their love and their savings into their homes, and their neighbors around them who have unslummed the area usually are both the victims and the cultural victims and the economic beneficiaries of gentrification in their neighborhood. So what do you do how does it affect the unslumming of homeowners in low and middle income neighborhoods to build new housing, to build tall housing? Does that affect the urban fabric that they have created? How does it affect that urban fabric? And what can be done to handle this in a sensitive and respectful manner? Another of Jane Jacobs type values, which has been incorporated into the governance structure of New York City since the 1970s, is a moderate form of community empowerment. And if, we went around the room and asked everybody, are you in favor of community empowerment? Probably most of you would say yes. But what does that really mean in practice? Does that mean that a neighborhood of NIMBYs can be empowered to protect the way they see their neighborhood through zoning? Or does it mean some other kind of governance that empowers communities without disenfranchising them, while also bringing new people into the governance consensus? Again, this is a really difficult situation. Not to go into nerdy type zoning minutia, but in New York City, the city government is very limited in the amount of land at its disposal. There's practically none, right, for the city government, practically no publicly owned for the city government to build on. And the city government has, as Max implied, very little money, no money, to put into building housing. The state government and the federal government, well, it's been decades since they put money into building new housing. So the city government, without land and without the desire or the capital to build housing, is stuck depending on real estate developers. Now, we could say that some politicians are always in bed with real estate developers because they are the major donors to the elected politicians' campaigns. That is certainly true in New York City and New York State and elsewhere. But what does it mean to have community empowerment through the system of zoning changes that New York City is governed by, when a community gathers its social capital together? And that could be a low-income community like East New York, a low to middle-income community like in Astoria, where there's a new project, a new private development project called Hallett's North, and the area of Soho, where there are renters and also owners of lofts and apartments who vary in income level. But all of them have the legal right in New York City to express their empowerment through their local community board, which has an advisory vote on zoning changes that alone are the mechanism to allow new housing to be built on scale. So this is an issue that we have to think about. YIMBY, NIMBY, of course we want to increase the housing supply. Of course we want people to be able to afford apartments or houses, or, some decent form of shelter. But how is that reconciled with the form of, even the very moderate form of community empowerment that Jane Jacobs' activism, and then my generation following that, struggled for? This is a very delicate balance. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a specific question and a big question. The specific question is, how do we produce more housing when we have a Midas effect, a Bezos effect, and a Marx effect? At least that's what I'd like to call them. The Midas effect is the King Midas of ancient Greece effect, the enrichment on the basis of private property. How can we get real estate developers who control private land and control building to be democratic and build a much greater amount of low-income and middle-income housing than they are inclined to do under present laws. The Bezos effect. Do you really have a situation in New York City where an increase in the supply of housing is going to increase the number of units of housing that will filter down to lower income people when you have a continued influx of great wealth into the housing market? Jeff Bezos, for example, does not live in New York City. He hardly ever visits New York City, but he owns 3 or 4 floors on top of an office building that was converted to luxury residences a few years ago. When you have a continual influx of the global rich and the global celebrity class and hugely rich people from the financial world, as well as from media and other kinds of industries, when you have this continued influx of wealth, which is part of the reason New York's economy has done well in the past 15 or 20 years, do you really have the possibility of increasing the supply of housing that will filter down to lesser mortals? And then the Marx effect, of course, is something Max also alluded to. That's Karl Marx, not Groucho. And that is that wages in this country are just not keeping up with price increases. It's not just a matter of the current inflation. There's been a big gap, like the opening of a scissors, between price increases, especially housing price increases, and lack of wage increases. And this is something that cannot be or is not being addressed at the moment by the YIMBY movement or by any housing movement. But it's a basic structural problem when talking about affordable housing. And then, of course, the other question is, as I suggested a few minutes ago, how can we reconcile community empowerment with more comprehensive social equity? I'll just leave you with that. Thanks.
Okay, good. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, I too am delighted to be here, back in this room. I think that the last time I did one of these, actually it was on Zoom, but it was talking about another great book by another great NYU sociology grad, also named Max. So anyway, it's glad to be back and to read this Max's book, which is fantastic. And I really enjoyed it. And I just want to start, and also Sharon, your comments are fantastic, wonderfully provocative. And I just want to start by sort of backing up to just sort of underscore how sort of unusual and unlikely it is that this YIMBY movement emerged, right? And even just a few years ago, really affordable housing advocates that I spoke to would just sort of, kind of throw up their hands and were largely resigned to sort of the recalcitrance of sort of exclusionary suburbs. And the fundamental political challenge, right, is that basically proposals to build more housing are characterized by sort of widely distributed benefits, right? We all are going to gain a little bit if we build more housing in New York, right? It's all that increased supply is going to reduce our rents a little bit, right? But concentrated costs, right? That the people immediately surrounding are the ones that are going to have their views blocked and their neighborhood character potentially threatened, right? And so as a result, the potential losers are much more motivated to go to those zoning meetings and to fight and to oppose the developments than the potential winners are to go to those community board meetings and to advocate for it. And that's what the empirical research also shows. So that's what happened. What happens if you go to the zoning board, community board meetings all across the country? The people who are there are the older white homeowners, right, who say no, right? And this is exacerbated by the fact also that the potential losers don't actually live in the community, right? They're the potential in-movers, right, who would like to move into that community, so they don't vote, they don't have political power in that community. And so it's sort of against all odds then, right, that this YIMBY movement has kind of emerged, and that you have people who are now getting people out to zoning board meetings in communities where they don't even live, and advocating for these developments because it's going to be good for everybody, right, in their view. And they've taken on many third rail issues, right, as both Max and Sharon suggested, right, exclusionary zoning, historic preservation, and as Sharon, as you said, sort of fundamentally the whole notion of local control and autonomy and community control over land use. And you know, I think part of the emergence, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this, the sort of timing lines up with sort of affordability pressures kind of climbing up the income ladder in the US. And so I think that's a little bit of what was sort of going on, and why all of a sudden it's like the middle class. I mean, prior to the 1990s, right, affordability pressures were really an issue for low income renters and not so much for middle income renters. So, but I will say that also the YIMBY movement has really scored some impressive wins lately. We even passed your book, right? Especially in you know, mostly on the state level, mostly on the West Coast. I think that they have learned a lot, that sort of some of the answer to this sort of is to kind of move up a level, right, where the debates are a little bit more about policy and building housing in general, but not about one particular development where you're going to have angry neighbors. And so they've been more successful at that level. One of the things I hope we'll have time to talk about is just a little bit about like why this has all happened in California and why things are moving so much more slowly in New York State. So against this backdrop, Max's book is really a fascinating account of how this movement has emerged, how it developed, how it's grown in multiple cities across the country. And I want to, you know, that it's incredibly well written, it's engaging, it's insightful. There are lots of things. I just want to sort of highlight a few, you know, real strengths. I think is one that I think this sort of focus on generational conflict, which I don't think has been brought out as much in writing on the YIMBY movement, and I found that very, very compelling. And I think it also shows, which is, you know, maybe fitting to sort of talk about at IPK too. It's sort of how all sides of every land use dispute basically claim the mantle of environmentalism. Like they also claim the mantle of Jane Jacobs, by the way, right? Everybody is like, this is what Jane Jacobs would want. This is good for the environment, and the contrast between sort of the older conservation movement. I mean, really in the chapter on Boulder and newer climate-led environmentalism, which is less about sort of preserving the landscape and less about conservation and more about reducing driving and energy use and emissions, I think is really, really striking. And I think, you know, this case in the Green Belt in Boulder is a great example of arguably good intentions gone bad. You know, and in many cases also the sort of what I would call maybe environmental appropriation is much more cynical. So many of you probably read the, you know, recent New York Times article about the Woodside, California, this wealthy Bay Area suburb that now is claiming that they're a mountain lion sanctuary, so that, you know, building duplexes would destroy the habitats of mountain lions in the area. So I think the book also, another strength I think, is really highlighting, it's sort of like celebrating the victories, but also really highlighting the weaknesses in a really interesting way. And I think, yeah, I mean, at times that I think that the YIMBY advocates have been too arrogant, right? That sort of, it's like, well, we're just smarter than you. Really, you just don't understand. Let me explain to you. And, you know, they've been, I think in many cases, too snarky, too mean, right? Talked about sort of, and social media has only sort of multiplied that and sort of amplified it. I think their demonization of NIMBY homeowners was not always that productive. And I think, Sharon, as you sort of pointed out, it really failed to acknowledge that in many cases, legacy residents, right, they view themselves not just as protecting their property values or their racial privilege, but as really protecting their communities, right? That they are, people view their neighborhoods as extensions of their homes, and legacy homeowners and renters too, right, feel that a deep-seated attachment to ownership over their communities, and they resist change. Sometimes change that those of us on the outside might think like, this is clearly good, not only for the world at large, but also for your community, but it's like, it's change, it's not. And most importantly, I think that Max, a lot of the book is sort of highlighting how the YIMBY movement stumbled when confronting the case of low-income neighborhoods. And I think, they could sort of no longer rely on this simple dichotomy of the growth and affordability advocates on the one hand and the exclusionary baby boomer, older white homeowners on the other. And they didn't always handle that well. And the YIMBY advocates, I think, really failed to appreciate the genuine fear that legacy residents have in gentrifying neighborhoods, that they're about losing their homes, about losing their communities, about losing their social networks. And I think, that said, right, and you sort of knew this was coming, right, that I would offer Max, I'd push back. The one pushback that I would offer to you is that why I fully agree that this has been an Achilles heel to some extent of the YIMBY movement. I think it's more of a failure of sort of political or communication strategy, and I think it's several points in the book that it seems to me you kind of simply accept the argument and the view that new market rate housing will displace, will lead to displacement of lower income legacy residents as a fact. And I think that, the research increasingly shows, in fact, that the development of new market rate housing doesn't actually increase rents. It doesn't actually accelerate displacement of immediately, and a new series of really well done studies show that it actually opens up vacancies. And in fact, and the way to think about this intuitively, I think, is to think that if you build, that you have a lot of neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification pressures. You have higher income households that want to move to those areas. Well, if you don't build, what's going to happen? Well, they're just going to bid up the prices of existing homes, right? And so if you build, it kind of creates something of like a safety valve to sort of absorb some of that demand. And that's not to say some of those apartments, right, are going to get occupied by maybe wealthy outsiders who aren't really, but some of them, and the research really shows this strongly in cities across the country, that many of them are occupied by people who move from other parts of the city and open up housing. And so it's not even that, you don't have to sort of argue that this luxury development, this market rate development is going to become affordable. It's that even just the fact of that market rate building then releases pressure in the market elsewhere. And now, that being said, I think these displacement anxieties are real, and they should be taken seriously. And there is a lot of displacement. It's just that building new market rate housing doesn't actually exacerbate that displacement. But even if direct displacement isn't elevated, communities may still suffer from cultural displacement, and which also imposes costs. So that's important as well. And so I think really a key question, maybe the question that I would leave for Max and for Sharon and for all of you really is to think about, take seriously this question about whether should we afford residents of lower income neighborhoods greater control over development than the residents of affluent neighborhoods and affluent suburbs, right? And I'd love to see the book. I'd love to see people engage. I feel like people don't engage fully with that question. I think there are arguments that you can make. Legacy residents of low-income neighborhoods typically have less ability to exit, right? They have less voice as well. They have less political power. They're also more likely to have kind of a rich, sort of ethnic community fabric that is tied to that community that they may rely on. And they're also often already relatively high density as well. So I think there's sort of arguments that you can make, but I feel like that's not a discussion that we typically have. One other sort of small point is that I feel like the book also, it's like this public housing versus market rate housing. But in fact, right, actually the US, right, supports a lot of subsidized housing. It's just that it's privately owned, but it's rent restricted, it's income restricted, it's means tested. And so it's not quite that simple. And I think And so, but anyway, but I would certainly agree with you that in moving forward, that the YIMBY movement should be more sensitive to these distinctions. It should try to build coalitions with affordable housing advocates. And I think to do so, the YIMBY advocates need to appreciate that while allowing more market rate housing in coastal markets is critical and will help to reduce prices and rents for most households, those new market rate homes are not going to do a lot, right, to alleviate the high rent burdens that so many, right, the vast majority of low-income renters in this country suffer. And so I think sort of the successful grand bargain that I hope that we'll see, right, will have to include both calls for more housing construction and more subsidies, right, for low-income rental subsidies. And I think building a successful coalition also requires showing sort of some respect, some more respect for the interests of neighborhood defenders, especially in gentrifying areas. So, but thank you for the book, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Okay. Terrific comments, and even more kind of substantive and thorough than I was expecting, and so that's great. But what it means is that A, you've left Max with lots of things that Max might want to say, and so Max, I want to give you a chance to jump in on any points. Actually, appreciate the kind of critical spirit of both, the appreciative and critical spirit of both comments, and it's better to do that in person, face to face, than to do it on the internet. I don't think Max is going to throw a bunch of exclamation points at you and have some nasty tweet. We can actually have a debate. Yeah, he'll do the meme later. So critical praise. That's what I said. Critical praise. So yeah, but of course, any author of a new book only registers the 1% of criticism. So Max, why don't you take any issues you'd like, and then I think what we're going to do is just jump to audience questions. And for those of you who are in the camera on Zoom, please post your questions in the question function on Zoom, and they will get relayed to me, and we'll do your best to get them. Max, go ahead.
First of all, I have a very heartfelt thank you to both of you, because it was really lovely to see you engaging with the book, and I'm very thankful for all the nice things you said. And I think the one thing that I'm really interested in terms of the market rate, I'll just keep this really short because I want to hear from what people have to say. But one thing I think is really interesting about YIMBYism, I think it really gets to what you're saying about how it's a very unlikely coalition. I think there's this kind of there's something that makes it seem like a big surprise, even in a place like San Francisco with a long history of housing activism. And I think the one big rhetorical trick that they did, and one big organizing trick that they did, was development was so demonized in many American cities that as soon as you said the word developer, there should be just sort of the kind of symbols or whatever they use as a percussion in horror movies, and that kind of viewpoint, I think some people who were involved in other housing movements saw as counterproductive, because it took people away from the table in neighborhoods that were trying to make decisions about growth. And so what that meant is that when activists were sort of so disgusted by the idea of working with developers, then they stepped away from the table. And developers built things anyway, but without affordability, without getting community benefits, and without having people at the table who were going to demand more from them. So I think that one thing the YIMBYs get really right is that they're kind of an alternative zoning board. They say, we are here, we have all these expertise, we're very well educated, and we want to separate the good developers from the bad developers, and let's stop pretending like development isn't going to happen. Let's normalize development as a process that happens in all American cities. And I think that that worked really well for them. And I think that also enlivened the debate, because they got back into the process and they started sorting through the details. And I think I'll just leave it there. Maybe we can chat more.
Before we open to the room, we did get a question on Zoom. That's for you, Ingrid, and it's just a simple one. Some people don't know the literature showing that building new housing does not cause displacement, and if there's a couple kind of key citations that you could give, I think some people are interested in finding them.
Okay, good. So I don't know if there's a place where I can write these down somewhere. Like, do you have a? Anyway, I would say that there are 4 papers. I would say there's Zhao Li. I'm not going to remember the titles, but it's in the Journal of Economic Geography. Evan Mast has a really nice paper on sort of chain migration, showing that when new development, new buildings are built, he shows where people are coming from to those buildings and shows that they're coming from sort of slightly lower income neighborhoods, and then the apartments that they vacate, people move in from slightly lower income neighborhoods, and so it's not that's a great paper. Also, Kate Pennington has a really nice paper looking at San Francisco, and Evan Mast again with Davin Reed and Brian Asquith have a really nice paper on looking at what happens to rents when you build new in multiple cities. Zhao Li's is in New York City. So I think those are the 4 papers that are sort of been recently written that are very strong on these. Yeah, I mean, they're. I actually haven't. I mean, I will say that 2 of those people are my former students, who I'm very, very proud of. But I haven't written specifically looking at the impact of market rate housing. I've actually looked more at sort of actually subsidized housing, because and shown that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't destroy property.
I want to pick up on subsidized housing too, and maybe kind of see if we can do something about this engagement with Max and the concern that public housing is implausible. That comes from the activists, but seems to you to be kind of not kind of fully acknowledging the extent to which the state is already in housing, and in which we have these subsidized units that include some number of market rate and also fixed income dwellings, and it is a really striking thing that we're at a kind of critical juncture in American policymaking, where we're seeing extraordinarily ambitious ideas in a number of different areas, and there's clearly a housing crisis that is really has been like a third rail issue, because my impression, and Ingrid, maybe I'm wrong about this, is that in all of the very ambitious stuff that's coming out of Washington right now, there's not really been a big embrace of significant money to deal with the housing crisis, either for older people who are dealing with serious issues around aging in place and aging alone and aging with the right kind of care, because we have a mismatch between the kinds of places available for older people and the kinds of places that older people need, and more old people than ever before. And then for younger people who are really, finding themselves to be locked out of the market in many places where they want to live. So it seems to me like this is an area that's teed up for really significant entrepreneurial policy ideas. So I guess my question is, am I missing something? Are there policy initiatives that are out there that we should know about that really do have kind of potential and promise? And then also with your kind of the debate with Max, could you push a little more? And Max, maybe you want to say something about this too. Are there possibilities for kinds of development that really would not be threatening in the way that some people fear?
So I think just very briefly, Professor Gould is quite right, which is that I think that I do sort of, when I'm talking about public housing, I'm usually talking about fully new construction, new builds that are all public. So 100% public housing, which not Section 8, not any kind of like sort of mix. And I think that there is definitely a potential of that being a little bit too cut and dry, because municipalities and state and federal government are invested in public housing and subsidizing housing. But what they're not doing is they're not building any new large public housing, which is a huge sort of goal of the Green New Deal. It's a big goal in terms of getting people who are at the most risk of homelessness, people who are having some of the worst problems in American cities today. Also, there's a lot of potential that some of these housing, if there were to be more public housing, it could be made with truly excellent environmental standards that could lead the way for showing other people how to make dwellings that address climate change and that are very energy efficient. That said, it's just not getting done. And it's not that it's not getting done on the timeline that we need, it's just not getting done, period.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that I think that it's sort of there are two things going on here, right? There actually is housing that's supported, quite a bit of housing that's 100% affordable, right? And low income, income restricted, new developments that are, built to high environmental standards that are getting built in the United States. What's different about them is that the land and the buildings are not owned by the public sector, right? They're subsidized by and they're restricted for decades. Used to be 30 years, now it's longer in most states. And look, I am absolutely, I think public housing is absolutely critical, especially in a critical resource, especially in cities like New York. But it's deeply affordable in a way that this other housing isn't. And but I just think that it's not. We do have 100%. We are still building. We're building it through public-private partnerships, and so it's not. It isn't. But like I said, it's 100% low income. No, I think this question about what developments will be I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think that there are. I mean, one answer would be that many times you have sort of communities that oppose developments, but then once the development is there, they're like, oh, not so bad, right? I mean, and so I think some of this is, I think there's sort of design challenges, there are communication challenges to get people really to understand what that, change is going to look like. I think there are ways to incorporate important sort of cultural, local community assets in the, libraries, for instance, right? We have some great, developments now in New York City sort of being built on top of libraries with sort of, so they've got beautiful, true community facilities and on the bottom. And so I think there are ways but it's not easy, and the politics are still difficult.
Yeah, and not really on most people's radar. Yeah, Sharon, jump in. You can, but you have to turn on your microphone first.
Thank you. Let me add a couple of New York things. First of all, we're talking about new build developments, and in a way that's not really what we are doing in New York City, except for infill, except for relatively small developments. And the larger developments, which are not truly huge developments, are actually being built on the waterfront, which is maybe not environmentally the best place to build them. And they are basically private sector developments with a certain number of affordable units. In New York City, it seems that a lot of housing construction for every income group is subsidized in some way or has been subsidized in some way. In the past year, a more progressive majority in the New York State Legislature abolished a set of tax credits for housing construction called by the number of the law 421A tax credits. And those credits were used by real estate developers building very expensive apartments as well as less expensive apartments. So it's not exactly a situation in New York City where development has not been subsidized, and a lot of that development has even been high rent or high rent development. Number two, a lot of the rental housing in New York City since the 1980s has been transformed into owner-occupied housing, which in every society in the world transfers property from low income or lower income people to higher income people who can afford to get a mortgage, who can afford to put their savings into buying a home, even at relatively modest prices. And a lot of those transfers from rental housing to owner-occupied housing have come in middle income and middle class apartment houses. I mean, without going into the specific laws that governed these, just a lot of the vanishing middle in New York City has vanished because, for a variety of reasons of self-interest on the part of different groups, property has been transformed from rental housing to owner-occupied housing. So that's a cruel structural situation that is not addressed by the YIMBY movement or by most other social movements in New York City. And then finally, again, not to get into the minutia of specific laws, but it is only a fairly large-scale zoning change that creates an opportunity to apply a zoning law called mandatory inclusionary housing that requires real estate developers to include a certain percentage, between 20 and 30% of units that are, quote, affordable, scare quote, affordable. There's a lot of debate over the affordability formulas, and I think a general acknowledgement that there are many, many people in New York City whose needs are not met by either the formulas that determine the rents and the minimum income you need to qualify for these affordable apartments, or the number of units. You know, we always have these terrible situations where tens of thousands of people are applying for a few hundred units of housing. So these are all issues that have to be addressed.
Thanks, Sharon. Okay, I want to try to get some of your voices in. So, Sam, do you have a microphone that you're going to pass around? Okay, raise your hand. So, see a question here. We're going to take a couple questions, actually. So one in the front, and then we're going to go one in the back before we get to Miles. And if you just hold off answering, we're going to do a couple questions together.
Thanks very much. This is terrific talk and conversation. I just wanted to pick up on that last point you were discussing about public housing, the feasibility of public housing, 100% low income, affordable public housing, and whether or not the disagreement here is really one of a mismatch of scale to the problem, right? Like, you know, maybe there is plenty of public housing that is being subsidized by the state and is in fact available and affordable for low-income residents, but it's simply nowhere near the scale that a scale that would match the problem. And if that's the case, I also want to follow that up just with a sort of more provocative question about whether or not the YIMBY movement is itself a symptom of a sort of impoverishment of political imagination, right? Like this phrase, private-public partnership, has become a sort of sine qua non of movable policy in the United States. That is a function of the last 50 years of history. And YIMBYism does nothing to address that. In fact, it furthers it. So I do wonder, you know, that gets into questions of generational politics and the kinds of progressives that are getting into office in New York and what their general demographic profile is. And I'll leave it there.
Sam, if you go all the way to the back, the back of the room, there's a hand up there. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll first of all echo everyone's thanks. My question is, so it seems like sort of inherently YIMBY is obviously like a local perspective or phenomenon just because it is, my backyard. And it seems like a lot of the examples or dynamics you were discussing had to do with people moving from possibly a lower income neighborhood into a neighborhood or from maybe the greater metropolitan area into a more urban center. I'm wondering, is there any facet of the YIMBY movement that deals more with movement city to city or within the US, state to state, and like longer distance migration and how YIMBY might draw people to a particular urban environment or, yeah.
Great. So just one more. Miles, can you raise your hand so Sam can find you?
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I'm Miles, sociology student. The growth of all or many of the big cities in the West has involved stealing water or, euphemistically, diverting water from other locations, which causes a lot of friction, right, with people in rural areas, indigenous communities, so on and forth. And so I was wondering, is there pushback against YIMBYism from people in other areas, or is this sort of simply a battle with urban areas and their peripheries and other people sort of just out there? And just linked to that and kind of like what the previous person was saying, in rural areas and even small cities, people really like them and they have all of these kind of misconceptions about urban areas, like there's crime and there's delinquency and the traffic, oh good God, is it really, if you build it, they will come? I'm kind of critical of using the market as a solution. Or will there have to be sort of a massive advertising campaign preaching the values of sort of this new living to people in order to motivate them to come?
So Max, why don't you go first, and then if Sharon or Ingrid want to add something.
Let me answer those questions in reverse order. So I do think that a lot of this is marketing an urban lifestyle to people who are reluctant urbanites for issues of environmental reasons. So live in a smaller apartment, drive less, go get a little colorful scooter off the street. And that's teaching people, it's kind of reteaching people the joys of urban life. That's a big part of YIMBYism. YIMBYism also would say that what they're doing is that the kind of exurban, not just suburban, but exurban sprawl that's happened in the American West is incredibly environmentally degrading. And those are the areas where you see competition between agricultural water uses and residential water uses. And that those areas, because of drought, because of fires, and because of the depleted Colorado River, are going to be an absolute priority in the near future. And so we need to get people out of those places and into closer to the city so that people stay in where the urban footprint is now, and God forbid they do not expand it farther. So that, I think those are all issues that they try to touch on. But one thing is, they do want to re-educate people into the joys of urban life. The other thing is, the kind of regional mobility issue is huge. So part of YIMBYism is about saying, I am from Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I really want to go to Dallas because I'm going to make, 40% more money. And so a lot of it is about the regional inequality that happens in the United States. So I'm from the Rust Belt, but I just have to get to, to Chicago. Like I don't want to live I'm trying to think of an example without maligning the city, but I don't. I don't want to be. So I think that those things are huge, and I think that that's a big part of the movement, which is saying that unfortunately economic advantage is very centralized now in certain cities, and Flint, Michigan is not one of them. So how do we get people who want to move to be able to move? And then last, it is a failure. The kind of, I think there is a huge amount of people on the left of the YIMBY movement saying, why not ask for more? If you're going to have this movement, which has been really successful in terms of marketing, which has really opened people's eyes up about urban planning, why not ask for something that's bigger? And why can't we have a mobilization that reinvests in not public-private partnership, but federally built public housing in the kind of grand tradition of the 1930s.
Well, I just want to add that there is a lot of discussion about alternatives in New York City, community land trusts, for example, limited profit kinds of apartments that would be owner occupied, but owners are prohibited from making a profit above a certain level, which would tend to keep the housing prices lower. But everybody thinks there's a God-given right to make as much money as you can from selling whatever property you can get your hands on. That's a big cultural problem.
So we just have a couple minutes left.
Can I
so
just say one thing?
Yep.
Just one thing, just sort of on this point. Again, there is public-private partnerships can build deeply affordable housing, and they do. Now, we may not get the subsidies right, but I would say the other thing that I think is really interesting in the book, and I didn't have a chance to say this, is that I think a lot of the contrast here, it's sort of, they're going for incrementalism. And I think they've been really, really successful. And so I think that's an interesting question. It's like, do you go for like the big, bold vision and then, where nothing's happened 20 years later? Or do you want to, like, you have all these incremental wins? And, I think that's a question for us all to think about.
I would love to just organize something on that another time, because I think this question was very similar to what I was asking also, which is where is this kind of political imagination around housing, given the scale of what we're doing in other areas? It seems like it's ripe for it. Any last questions or points before we break up for the night? It's about 6:30. I know everyone's ready to go eat. If not, I didn't say this before, but ordinarily at IPK book events, we have a book vendor. We make everyone buy the book when they leave. We guilt them into it. We're not going to do that tonight. We're not fully back to form. We don't fully have the book vendors here. We'll do that in time. But get a copy of Max's book. Go to the library and demand that they get it so you can borrow it from them if you're not going to buy it. There's some students here. Apparently NYU is expensive, I read. Support Max and support your city and support our future, and come to IPK. It's such a pleasure for us to see all of your faces here. We're going to have lots of events like this over the course of the semester. Sign up for our mail list. And Max, congratulations on this great feat. Sharon and Ingrid, thank you for joining the conversation, and I'll see you all very soon. But good night.